The time is June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, Bosnia, when two shots are heard around the city center. Someone has just lost their life, and many civilians are well aware of it. But what they didn't know at the time is that the shots were delivered to none other than Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. The whole world was shocked as the shooter was later identified as young Serbian Gavrilo Princip. He intended to push the Austro-Hungarian Empire to declare war on Serbia, and he did just that. Only 1 month later, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and that is what would spark the beginning of the First World War. Hello, my name is Giorgio Irado. This is my thesis and the story of the Christmas truce. During the first year of World War I, along the Western Front, young British and German soldiers agreed to an informal ceasefire in the cold trenches on Christmas Eve. Their Christmas truce demonstrated the shared responsibility of soldiers seeing their enemies as human beings and standing up for the most precious human rights, their right to life. While short in duration, the Christmas truce left a powerful legacy. At the start of the war, Britain was mainly in charge of helping their allies. Britain didn't declare war on any country until they felt scared or intimidated by German domination. They now had new aerial combat technology that the British had never seen before, which was one of the main reasons why in August of 1914, Great Britain declared war on Germany. The early months of the war quickly sprung to show how bloody this war would be, both in the air and on the ground. People were dying, buildings were falling, families were sad, but Max Brooks, author of Harlem Hellfighters, thinks it was all for nothing.
Stupid. That's how I would encapsulate the First World War. World War I did not have to happen. There was no inherent reason. It literally was dumb.
Being in the trenches was a horrific experience and cannot be described at all through film, words, or any other way than actually being there. You watch people around you die, the only thing you smell is the dead, and you would only be able to go home dead or injured. Throughout history, everyone knows that war is horrific, but no war describes it better than World War I. It was a trench war, and there was new technology in fighting tactics. But amongst that war was a small sign of humanity that wouldn't impact the war, but would show what war really was and why it shouldn't be fought. Word got out amongst the soldiers that they would be home by Christmas with their families in their warm homes, and that the war would be over with. Unfortunately, this was not the case, as Christmas had approached and no soldiers were sent home. Some soldiers began preparing for the fact that they wouldn't be home by Christmas, until many, in an effort to end the war, started to suggest the silence of gunfire on Christmas Day. Pope Benedict XV declared that the guns may fall silent at least upon the night the angels sang. 100 British women wrote open letters to the women of Germany and Austria in an effort to come together and push for a truce at Christmas. All these requests went to nothing, as the generals refused all requests to ensure a bloody battle on Christmas Day. As Christmas Eve approached, generals became more stubborn about the idea of a ceasefire on Christmas, until finally the night came. Christmas Eve was a strange day for the soldiers. It was cold and gloomy, but most peculiar of all, there was not as much gunfire as usual. However, British soldiers would not let their guard down, as this could be a perfect setting for a trench raid. Since nothing had happened, soldiers started writing letters and diaries to their families, while Germans and British yelled rude but joking statements over the trenches.
And we'd been shouting to each other, sometimes rude remarks, more often just joking remarks.
This went on for a bit until a German soldier in broken English shouted, "Tomorrow, you no shoots, we no shoots."
Anyway, eventually a German said, "Tomorrow, you no shoot, we no shoot."
The soldiers replied by setting up Christmas trees, and suddenly joy had filled the air. There were fires lit, and the soldiers were shocked but also quiet. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of singing from the opposite trench.
On Christmas Eve, we'd been singing carols and this, that, and the other, and the Germans had been doing the same.
Germans had begun singing carols. Obviously, it was hard to understand what the Germans were singing. but Private Frank Sumter was one of the first to recognize what they were singing.
We heard a German singing Holy Night, of course in German, naturally.
The British had joined in. Both sides of the trenches began singing carols in different languages, and they sang for a bit before slowly dying down on that cold Christmas Eve night. The following day, all is still quiet, and there are subtle murmurs of what had happened the night before, unaware of what was about to unfold atop no man's land. There's a sign of relief that there is no fighting, but also a sign of depression, wishing they were home with their families. 18-year-old Alfred Anderson remembers waking up on Christmas morning in a barn house, a short distance away from the front line, to absolute silence. He said that he and a couple of others in the barn house went out to listen to the silence, as they weren't too used to it. He says he remembers yelling out "Merry Christmas," but nobody responded. Suddenly in the trenches, a British soldier starts yelling, and all of the British soldiers peek over the trenches with their rifles ready to fire, when they spot a German out atop their trench, prepared to shoot. But with a closer look, the soldiers realize that the German isn't preparing to shoot, and he isn't armed. He's high atop the trench, waving his arms while shouting. The German then pops down back below cover, thinking someone would shoot him, but nobody did. So he popped his head back up again, waving his arms, and still there's no gunfire. Suddenly the surrounding Germans and British pop their heads out while waving to their enemies. Suddenly, one by one, each soldier pours out of the trenches on the front line until the two sides meet and shake hands. The truce started slowly. They nervously shook hands and talked about their families. Eventually they exchanged cigarettes and played games while laughing and having a good time on both sides. Some British soldiers reported seeing one of their friends cutting German hair. Another soldier reported cutting off the button of a German soldier in exchange for his buttons. Many warm-hearted soldiers tended to their enemies' injuries and helped them bury the fallen. And some soldiers even said that they had a makeshift soccer match. All day long, soldiers were enjoying Christmas rather than fighting a disgusting, violent, meaningless war that terrorized people. It was reported that Adolf Hitler was in the trenches during the truce and said such a thing should not happen in wartime, having no German sense of honor. Unfortunately, the British generals felt the same about the truce. They were still hiding in the trenches, fearing death by German snipers, and they even tried to prevent the truce. That night, British soldiers wondered if they would wake up to fighting yet again the next day. When soldiers woke up the next morning, still zero gunfire. And yet again, they met atop doing much of the same celebrations. However, the generals soon reminded them that having an unofficial alliance with the enemy is only one step away from treason, which is punishable by death. So unfortunately, the next day, when a German came up, a British soldier shot him dead. At that moment, a truce of an estimated 100,000 men had ended. Although the Christmas truce was significant, it did not impact the war, which ended 3 years later. Instead, it caused government officials to push for laws preventing a future truce. When Christmas came the following year, many asked soldiers for a second Christmas truce, but generals were unhappy with what had happened the previous year. Any high-rank official in the trenches strictly prohibited any friendly interaction with the enemy in any way possible. Though it hadn't done anything for the war, it did something for the soldiers and the families at home. Imagine the relief of the parents to find out that their children were having just as much as fun as they were on Christmas. As one young soldier said, he wouldn't miss it for the most gorgeous Christmas dinner in England. Today, exactly 110 years later, the Christmas truce is remembered as a significant event that showed beauty rising from the ashes of war. Even if it lasted only a few days, though not seeming to mean much, the Christmas truce was a sign of humanity in one of the bloodiest British wars in history. After 2014, the 100th anniversary, Sainsbury's made an ad about the Christmas truce. German and British veterans' great-grandchildren met and shook hands. There were multiple statues of men shaking hands and holding soccer balls, meaning that the Christmas truce was important because it was one of the main examples of peace on earth and rights and responsibilities on that silent night of 1914.